Why are Palestinians enduring deadly starvation in the Gaza Strip? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Sam Rose, the acting director of UNRWA operations in the Gaza Strip. Sam Rose, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Hi, Ming. Very happy to be on.
Um, I'd like to start by looking at the situation before October 2023. We've often heard that there was, people have compared it, the Gaza Strip, before October 2023 to an open air prison. We saw reports that there was already malnutrition. At the same time, it seemed to have a challenged yet functioning health system. Could you paint a general picture of humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip, let's say in September 2023?
Yeah, I can. And I visited last before the war, actually, in September.
And
20.
if I may interrupt you, if it's possible for you to turn up your volume a little bit, please.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, you do all the editing and everything after this, yeah?
Preferably we publish it as live, but let's start over then.
Okay. I'm just going to turn off any notifications as well so that they
Yeah,
don't come in and I don't get distracted. Sorry.
no
I didn't
problem.
realize
I'll
we
start
were
over.
doing it live. Okay.
Why are Palestinians enduring deadly starvation in the Gaza Strip? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Sam Rose, the acting director of operations in the Gaza Strip for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. Sam Rose, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Hi, Maine. Very happy to be on.
I'd like to start by asking you about the humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip prior to October 2023. People often spoke of the world's largest open air prison, of intensifying malnutrition, particularly among children. At the same time, it seemed to be a functioning society with a challenged yet functioning health infrastructure and so on. Could you give us a general overview of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip prior to October 2023?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I've been going in and out of Gaza for 25 years, and throughout the time that I've been doing that, living there and visiting, I mean, Gaza, the vast majority of the population of Gaza have needed some kind of humanitarian assistance. And you've spoken already, Maureen, to one of the reasons for that. It's the closure and access restrictions that have been in place in Gaza since the mid 90s and the Oslo years, which were massively tightened when the Second Intifada started in 2000, and then became formalized as a blockade when Hamas came into power in 2007. And what that meant was that a workforce that had previously been employed largely inside Israel all of a sudden lost its means of employment. So overnight, with the closure that came in the Second Intifada, about 100,000 Palestinians overnight lost their job, and that precipitated a kind of massive unemployment-led recession in Gaza that somehow continued throughout a period of 20 years. So Gaza on the eve of October 2023 was a place that had had the highest rates of unemployment of anywhere in the world,
Particularly youth unemployment, if I remember correctly.
particularly youth unemployment. So the highest rates of unemployment really anywhere in the world over a period of 2 decades throughout the 21st century. And at the same time, it's a young population. Fertility rates are relatively high still. So there, and it's a highly educated population. So there are tens of thousands of new graduates and young people coming onto the labor market each year who have no means whatsoever of securing any kind of job. The biggest employers in Gaza were the public sector and they were UNRWA. The commercial sector had been massively squeezed, with the exception of the tunnel economy, which is maybe something we can come back
Mm.
to later if the conversation goes that way. So that's one element of it, a population that has limited means to provide for themselves. The other part of it, which I think is
If I
crucial
could
to
just clarify, if you don't mind on that point, I think also a key driver of the agricultural economy of the Gaza Strip was exports to the West Bank, since exports abroad were largely made impossible. And I think that was shut off during the 2000s as well.
It was. So the productive parts of Gaza's economy were largely shut off. What you had, and this is what I was going to come back to, and I'll come to it in the second part of my answer to your question, is a an economy that's led by services and construction. And when I say construction, a
Mm,
lot of this was post-conflict reconstruction.
mhm,
A series of relatively short but bloody and brutal conflicts that had characterized life in Gaza really since the end of the Second Intifada, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, and then in between kind of shorter, more sporadic periods of conflict. And what that meant was that a highly traumatized population, young, a 16-year-old on the eve of the 7th of October, had lived through five conflicts. They may well have lost their homes. They may well have seen loved ones die. They'd certainly been in a classroom where one of their classmates had died. And then at the end of that, of course, in 2019, we had the Great Marches of Return, the non-violent demonstrations close to the border, which saw tens of thousands of young Palestinian men maimed and kneecapped. So, as well as a population that didn't really have the means to care for itself economically, you also had a highly traumatized population. All sorts of reports before the war. I think Save the Children brought out a report in 2021 saying that 80% of children in Gaza were depressed already before this war. They'd been exposed to things really that no child should be exposed to. So that was really the bulk of what the humanitarian programming in Gaza was doing. It was providing basic food assistance to the population. UNRWA, we were feeding 1.2 million people. We were creating temporary employment schemes, and we were also providing for the mental health and psychosocial needs of a population that was living a far from normal existence. But like you said, I mean, the basic services continued. The healthcare is relatively good. Education is relatively good. Some decent universities in Gaza, and I mean, Gaza has some of the highest rates of literacy anywhere in the Middle East, and historically has done. So the basics of kind of civil service provision and municipal services were relatively okay. At the same time, it was a place that was massively overcrowded. Environmental concerns as a result of some of this, the overuse of the water table, the inability of Palestinians to properly dispose of waste and garbage and things like that, meant that it wasn't perfect by any means, but people were relatively happy there.
But in addition to that picture that you've painted, were there already, let's say, protracted challenges? Were there elevated levels of, for example, child anemia? Was healthcare that could not be provided within the Gaza Strip accessible to those who needed it in terms of getting exit permits to either Egypt, Jordan, or Israel? What were the main humanitarian challenges, besides the ones that you've mentioned prior to 2023, in relation to the ones that we're experiencing now?
Yeah, look, there was very little malnutrition
Mhm.
before this current war. I mean, UNRWA, we're now the largest screener and the
So it
largest.
wasn't a significant problem in 22.
No, it wasn't. I mean, UNRWA, we run the largest primary part of the primary healthcare
Mhm.
system in Gaza. We weren't providing nutritional services inside Gaza before the war. Our staff were trained by UNICEF staff during the war to provide that care. It wasn't really needed. There were, as you say, there were problems with anemia.
Mhm.
But to be honest, aside from the psychosocial and mental health consequences of living in this, I mean, open air prison really isn't the word for it because people have done nothing wrong. They've not committed any kind of crime. But the impacts of that closure and the impacts of the repeated episodes of conflict meant that psychosocial support, mental health was in great need. Very little capacity inside Gaza to provide for that, given the limited number of psychiatrists and psychologists. And as you said, there was a lot of healthcare that people needed inside of Gaza that they couldn't get inside of Gaza. So they were reliant on permits to get to hospitals in East Jerusalem, to get to the West Bank, to get to Egypt, places like that, which in many instances were just reliant on the goodwill
Mhm.
of the Israeli authorities or about something else if they could be used to exert pressure. But in many ways, the health conditions of the population in Gaza were pretty similar to health conditions of any kind of lower middle class place. Children didn't die of communicable diseases. Adults died of diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, things like that. So the health profile of the population was, with the exception of the mental health and the trauma elements of it, and the large number of wounded, were quite similar to what you'd see in other places
Mm.
around the world.
And regular healthcare, if I can use that term, things that didn't require specialized procedures or rare illnesses, was generally available within the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I mean, look, one reason, and the Lancet have said this, that one reason that deaths from communicable diseases during the war have not been as high as they might be is because the basic healthcare programs that were put in place by UNRWA since the 1950s and supported by the donors in terms of
Very high vaccination rates.
exactly. The universal rates of vaccination meant that the fundamentals and the underlying kind of health floor was relatively good. Anyone would go to a health clinic to get their child vaccinated because they were everywhere. The quality of the doctors was good and the vaccines were available. And look, Gaza showed, I mean, the strength of its health system was shown during the COVID pandemic, where everyone pulled together and managed to keep the numbers of cases relatively low. Of course, there were other reasons for that, but the system did a good job in terms of making sure that people got their vaccines.
And if I'm not mistaken, beginning with the Second Intifada, UNRWA began providing services on behalf of international donors to the entire population of the Gaza Strip and not only to the population of registered refugees. Is that correct?
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, in times of emergency, UNRWA is mandated to extend that emergency and humanitarian assistance to the entire population. And that's what we've done during the current conflict, reaching 2.1 million with food, opening our shelters to anyone who needs them, things like that. Decisions were taken in the early 2000s to extend, to adjust the lineage of UNRWA service provision. So women who were married to non-refugees, their children became eligible for services without them being registered as Palestine refugees. But all this was taking place in a climate where the host provision was being squeezed. So in a quote unquote normal environment, people would choose whether to send their child to an UNRWA school or a host school. In an environment where the host authority is starved and UNRWA's provision and the quality of its services were considered good and better than the host. That created a large demand in terms of UNRWA services. So over the first decade of this year, you did see a massive jump in the number of beneficiaries and the number of people benefiting from UNRWA's education, healthcare, etc.
I'd now like to turn to the situation beginning in October 2023. What were there immediate visible impacts in terms of the humanitarian situation, apart from the bombings and so on that we could all see on our television screens and the death and destruction? What were the major thresholds or turning points that you and UNRWA more generally have experienced during the past 2 years?
Yeah, look, I was in Amman on the morning of October the 7th, and I think we all woke up with the same sense of shock in terms of what was happening and playing out in front of our eyes. And given the enormity of the atrocities conducted by Hamas, it was pretty clear from the start that there was going to be a massive response to this, and that manifested itself in a couple of ways in those immediate days. First was a bombardment and attacks and military operations on Gaza City at a level that we'd not seen before. So
You're talking
massive.
now about the evening of October 7th, so to
Well,
speak. Yeah.
those first few days, once Israel had started to mount a response, the intensity of those bombardments and the level of killing in those first few days was, including in terms of UNRWA staff, was unlike really anything we'd seen in previous episodes of conflict. And coupled with the fact that a number of hostages were taken back into the Gaza Strip, it was pretty clear within an hour or so that this was on a level that we'd not seen before, and people really did fear for the worst. And then, of course, a week into the conflict, on it, I don't know, the 12th or the 13th of October, an evacuation order was issued for the entire north of the Gaza Strip, Gaza City, and points north. People were just ordered south. So whereas in previous conflicts, we'd seen people fleeing parts of town that were under bombardment and seeking refuge in UNRWA schools, in UNRWA buildings under the UN flag. We've not seen mass movement of population from one part of Gaza to another part of Gaza in this way, not in any of the conflicts since the early 2000s that I've been involved in, and that just meant a massive disruption to the UN system, to the humanitarian system, but also to people who were just on the move, and that really created the model for what followed in terms of repeated cycles of displacement, repeated evacuation orders, people constantly on the move, and the humanitarian system as well, constantly having to regroup and consolidate and adjust where it was providing services from in terms of the operational hubs and the coordination and things like that, how it was getting those supplies in, and also the people it was serving, because the population were regularly on the move as well.
Because I
So
think, if I'm not mistaken, those evacuation orders applied to UNRWA and its staff and facilities as well, or at least the UNRWA leadership felt compelled to also evacuate those areas. Is that correct?
that's right. So for the first time, the UNRWA leadership and the UN leadership in general, overall, not just UNRWA, took a decision to evacuate Gaza City, like I say, overnight, within about a week of the conflict, and move to Rafah.
What was it the impression that the UN flag had become meaningless to the Israeli authorities? What was the reasoning behind this measure?
I wasn't party to those discussions, so I can't speak with much or authority, but I think the signals were there in terms of the intensity of the bombardments. And when safe passage was being offered for security reasons, those who were granted it decided to take it. I mean, it still ripples across the community that the UN system did leave its premises in Gaza City. We never complete. I mean, we're back there today,
Mhm.
but it meant the end of permanent presence of international UNRWA staff from inside of Gaza City. But look, they'd spent days inside a compound being bombarded in fear of their lives. It was only because of a bunker that had been built a couple of years earlier that many staff felt that that's what saved them. Again, as I say, the level and intensity of the bombardments and the operations was such that the teams felt that they had no choice.
And the number of UNRWA staff, unfortunately, often along with families who were being killed, began to rise quite precipitously early on. According to your information, were these people killed on the job or primarily in their homes? Was there, in your view, any kind of deliberate targeting involved? How do you explain the increasing numbers of killings of aid workers in the Gaza Strip? I'm talking now during the first few months, the final months of 2023, and a figure that I think rapidly exceeded deaths of UN personnel in any other conflict.
Yeah, it did. And look, we have now over 300 staff of ours who have been killed. Like you say, the vast majority in those first weeks and months of the year, so up until November, December time. But again, if you look at the graphs in terms of the rate of killing of the population at large, it's similar. There was a
Mhm.
massive spike in those first months. It kind of leveled off a bit, and then we've seen a bit of a spike with the breakdown of the ceasefire. And look, despite the constant questioning of the Ministry of Health and the Hamas data, in terms of fatality numbers. The number of UN and UNRWA staff killed broadly tracks the rate of mortality or conflict-related mortality amongst the population as a whole. The vast majority have not been killed on duty.
Mhm.
Some have, some in shelters, whilst tending to people, some at distribution centres, warehouses, and things like that. A small number on their way to and from the office. A small number, as with the general population, whilst under evacuation order, have been killed whilst
You mean
fleeing
in the
from
process of evacuating?
in the process of evacuating to a quote unquote safe humanitarian zone. There have been a few staff who've been killed, but look, the vast majority of them have just been killed in their homes, in their tents, like the rest of the population. And so we can't really talk of deliberate or targeting of UNRWA staff, but just the level of killing that is inevitable given the urban makeup of Gaza and the fact that it's so overcrowded, that people are living in such close quarters, the types of munitions and weapons that have been used have meant that it's inevitable that large numbers of people will be killed, regardless of whether or not they are the target of these operations. Uh, and I think about 40% of all the UNRWA staff who've been killed have been females
Hmm. Hmm.
as well, which also, that's broadly in line with the makeup of our workforce as well.
And
So
that would also, I think, tend to argue for people being primarily killed in their homes.
in their
Or
homes, in their tents, or
yeah,
going about their
yeah,
daily
yeah.
their daily business. Yeah.
Then, we move into 2024, and the growing humanitarian emergency in the Gaza Strip begins to become increasingly prominent alongside the vast volume of death and destruction caused by military operations. Um, of course, it hasn't been a linear process, so to speak. There have been spikes and there have been periods of relaxation. What were the main issues that arose during the past, let's say, beginning and early 24? Was it the destruction of the health infrastructure? Was it the prohibition on the entry of goods for prolonged periods? What were the main measures and what were the main impacts for the Palestinian population and, of course, for your work as well?
Yeah, look, I first got to Gaza at the end of January 2024, and back then, uh, half the population was in Rafah and in Mawasi.
Hmm.
So back then you had, yeah, large swathes of the population just living on beachland, on scrubland, on areas that are not meant for long-term habitation and where there's very little service provision in terms of, sewage networks, roads, etc. And back then we were just waiting for the moment when the incursion into Rafah would or wouldn't happen. So people were faced with, appalling living conditions, and it's Gaza in January, February, so it's very cold,
Hmm.
living in very cramped quarters, but also had this looming fear of an operation which was just gonna occur at Israel at the time of Israel's choosing. So, and this is, I think, the reality of life for people in Gaza in general, that they have very little control over any elements of it. So they feel, living in constant conditions of cruelty and humiliation and powerlessness. At the same time, we had large populations in Gaza City and the north that we really couldn't access because of the separation of Gaza between the north and the
Was
south.
was UNRWA denied entry into the northern Gaza Strip? How did that work?
No, I mean, it was very difficult for any aid entity to make the move south to north across either the beach road or the Netzarim corridor. It all had to be coordinated with Israeli officials. It would you could wait for days for those approvals to come in. Quite often in the middle of the night, you just get notification to say that it hadn't been approved. Quite early on, I think from about April time, UNRWA was not permitted to go on its own on missions. We had to go on joint missions with other UN entities, which just made for a much more convoluted bureaucratic process, which again is a characteristic of the way the occupying power exercises its control over different elements of life, the minutiae of life, the basics are what takes up time, and it kind of grinds you down and it demotivates you, and you spend all your time trying to do what should be pretty straightforward. I mean, for us, these are just bureaucratic hurdles, but this is, people's life and death decisions in terms of water, in terms of access to food, in terms of things like that. So we had the whole period early on in 2024. We were really just in a holding pattern, waiting for this incursion and operation that we knew was going to happen to happen, and kind of fearing the
In
worst
Rafah.
in Rafah.
Hmm.
And then, of course, it did happen in May.
Mhm.
But in the period running up to that, the period before that, we had complete and unfettered access really to the crossing point. So we were able to bring in hundreds of trucks of supplies a day. We had complete oversight of everything that was coming and going from that crossing point, and we could access it freely because it wasn't a conflict zone. When the operation began,
Sorry,
and
these
we
were coming in from Egypt, from Kerem Shalom.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the main entry point then was stuff coming in from Egypt.
Mhm.
And it was very easy for us to access those supplies. We could basically come and go. I mean, my guys were down there at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they'd work until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, just clearing whatever needed to be cleared. There were sometimes problems on the road because as the conflict went on, the roads became more and more damaged. But we had pretty much complete control over everything, and that changed dramatically and abruptly when the Rafah operation happened, when it meant that every time we needed to go to the crossing point, we had to navigate our way through an active conflict zone, which, as you can imagine, becomes much more fraught,
Now,
dangerous, and time consuming.
just to be clear, prior to the Israeli invasion of Rafah, the Israelis were not in control of the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. Is it correct to say you needed only Egyptian authorization to cross into the Gaza Strip, or were the Israelis or others somehow involved in this as well? Presumably, you needed some kind of assurance that your trucks wouldn't be bombed when they entered the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, no, totally. And look, we used to at that point, we would travel from Cairo
Mhm.
to Rafah. And as part of the EU border
Mhm.
assistance mission, EU BAM, I
Yeah,
think that's
from
what it stands for.
2005. Yeah.
Exactly, that came in following as part of the movement on agreement on movement and access brokered by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. You
Uh,
remember
this is
back then.
related to the so-called Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So that put in place a mechanism where Israel was involved in coordination and seeing what was coming and going and who was coming and going, but they weren't physically present on at the crossing point. I mean, what you did have and what you do have, which is one of the funny kind of or strange kind of sidebars on some of this, is that there are Israeli contractors who are working at the crossing who determine who can come and who can go. So there was still a measure of control,
Mhm.
but we were also able to access the crossing all day, every day, if we wanted to, and it meant that we had much better control over our own supplies, over what was happening. We didn't need to seek convoluted Israeli permissions to get into the crossing point, which is what we had to from May onwards. And some of this is legitimate because it's an active conflict zone, and we coordinate our movements in situations of conflict anywhere in the world. It doesn't absolve the parties to the conflicts of their obligations to protect us, but it kind of it supports them in doing that. But of course, military imperatives come first. So following the start of the operation in May, we lost that complete access, and it
Because
became
the Israelis took over the border zone, essentially.
it took over the border zone, and we had to coordinate everything through them, and you
Mm.
have to wait at multiple crossing points and holding points and checkpoints on the way in,
Mm.
constantly waiting for the green light. We were always waiting for the green light. That's all that everyone did. It would be on, many of the aid workers who work there, on the day they die, they'll remember the green light because it was what ruled so much of our lives. And it just meant that whereas previously we could do 300, 350 trucks, we were down to much, much smaller numbers of that at a time when the operation happened, when lots of people were on the move again, and people left from Rafah and they snaked their way up into Khan Yunis and Deir el-Balah. So we were faced, as we have been throughout the conflict, with a situation where needs are increasing and we need to adjust how we respond to those needs at the same time when our ability to do that, either through lack of supplies or because the service points for UNRWA, that means our health centers and things like that. For the health system in general, it means the hospitals are inaccessible or they're under attack or they're in evacuation zones, etc. So that was a big turning point in May when that operation happened and it led to large scale movements of population and it just changed the dynamics in terms of how we were
If I could
operating.
just ask you a question about the Egyptian role in this,
Mm.
because many people have been critical of the Egyptians, including Palestinians, saying that the Egyptians are basically subordinating the provision and entry of aid to Israeli wishes. But I'm trying to get an understanding of how this worked. I presume you needed Egyptian authorization to transit from Sinai into Gaza. Was this as complex a bureaucratic issue as what you've been describing with the Israelis?
I mean, it was complex. It wasn't dangerous.
Hmm.
It was complex because, I mean, the Egyptian bureaucracy is a complicated thing. It was
Oldest
complex.
bureaucracy in the world.
Well, yeah, yeah, down to the hieroglyphics was when all this was first codified, of course. But it was also made more difficult by the fact that this was all happening in El Arish in northern Sinai, which is a military zone, and it's an area where it's not easy for aid entities or for anyone to come and go as they please. You can't come and go. So movement into those areas has to be coordinated, has to be approved. Any country in the world would struggle with the scale of the response that was needed for the Gaza emergency. And as has often been the case, and it is a way in which the conflict is managed or the access regime is managed, you're essentially dealing with one or two crossing points.
Hmm.
And the minute those are choked off, then everything gets backed up and everything becomes more and more complicated. So yeah, it wasn't easy
Hmm.
in the slightest,
But were
unfortunately.
there also cases where the Egyptians would deny UNRWA or others permission to enter the Gaza Strip? In other words, um, were Egyptian decisions also involved in tightening the siege, or was this or was this an Israeli decision that then applied to everybody?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Egyptians have not been the ones saying that children's scissors can't come into Gaza because
Mhm.
they're dual use, that balloons can't come into Gaza, that spiral pasta can't come into Gaza. The Egyptian authorities were not the ones that were turning trucks back because of dual use items or things that were not permitted. They were not the ones who were enforcing a very arbitrary process of denials and approvals of the supplies getting in. There were complexities around the bureaucracy of it, and there still are, given the scale of the operation and the fact that any bureaucracy is difficult. But they weren't imposing measures such as this, not as far as I'm aware.
Mhm.
Anyway.
I'd now like to turn to the more recent. I mean, hunger was increasing throughout 2024 at the same and during the same period. The operations of UNRWA and of other aid agencies were becoming more complex and more challenging. Um, let's fast forward now to the past several months. UNRWA was effectively banned from operating in the Gaza Strip, and we'll get to that in the moment. And then Israel sought to replace it with this project that it called the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. And every UN agency and every other humanitarian and aid agency in the Gaza that was active in the Gaza Strip not only refused to cooperate with this project, but publicly denounced it. Can you explain why the GHF project was considered objectionable, given that, its leadership says they're only there to feed people?
Yeah, look, we had a perfectly adequate and a perfectly well functioning aid distribution system inside the Gaza Strip. In fact, the longest uninterrupted aid distribution program managed by the UN anywhere in the world. Complete control over the end-to-end process, able to reach people at scale, in safety, and with dignity. That's largely the UNRWA system that I'm describing there, as you probably guessed, but complemented by others. That was functioning perfectly adequately. In the space of 4 days during the ceasefire, we assisted 1 million people. And we simply don't have the luxury to do any less than that when you've got a population that's on the verge of starvation. And this was all managed through around 400 different distribution points, the system as a whole,
In the
which went
Gaza Strip.
across the Gaza Strip,
Mm.
so we could reach people where they were. People did not have to travel long distances through dangerous terrain to get the aid that they want. What
Because
is
you essentially brought it to their doorstep, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, look, Gaza is not a logistics problem. I
Mhm,
mean, all we've done, and we've spoken about it for about 15 minutes of this interview, but the way the conflict and the response is framed as around logistics.
mhm.
It's around truck numbers. It's around, this is not about logistics. Gaza is the easiest place in the world to distribute aid. It's
Because it's a
flat.
very small territory, flat.
Small, flat, roads are okay. People understand. They trust the aid agencies. We can do it. We've shown that we can do it repeatedly. You take that away and you replace it with up to four of these points that require people to travel relatively long distances, 10, 20, 30 kilometers, to be herded through cattle pens, and we all know what images that drums up through an active conflict zone where they are often shot and often killed. No way whatsoever for the most vulnerable to get the assistance. What's happening is that essentially, you know, traders are paying people, paying heavies to get to the front of the queue to rip open the aid boxes, take the items that are more valuable for on onward sale, take them to market, and the people who need the food most do without. And worse, they do without, and they get shot on their way to and from these points because they're traveling in the middle of the night to get there through active conflict zones. The minute they wander off, you know, because it's pitch black and because the roads aren't great anymore in Gaza, they wander off the routes. They're fair game in terms of the rules of engagement. So there's no safety for the population. There's no ability to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the most vulnerable. And essentially, we're entrenching and legitimizing let me put that another way, by legitimizing a system that's been put in place by I'm not putting this a very good way. The problem is with how aid is it's an access issue, and if you're legitimizing and accepting that, then you're further entrenching the system that's meant that people haven't got the aid that they need over the last 18 months. So it further embeds and entrenches part of the problem, and it's all being administered by one party of to the conflict. So it's not helping
So
the
the
people.
weaponization of aid?
weaponization of, and it's not even weaponization of food aid, because it's not even aid, it's just boxes of food, and you know, large numbers of meals are put out there that baffle and distract, when in fact the quantity of aid that's actually reached the people is far, far less than what was needed, and far, far less than what was done over the first, during the ceasefire. I mean, I think in their entire 2.5 months of existence, they have dropped fewer meals than UNRWA distributed in 10 days during the ceasefire. We're able to make sure that the most vulnerable get that assistance first. We can provide tents, we can provide clothes, we can provide blankets, we can provide all these things that people cannot traipse half the way across Gaza in the middle of the night to get. And then, they're told that these sites are opening. Within 5 minutes, they're closed. Stories the other day of women only days, and women were subject to, pepper spray and sound bombs and things like that. So a really, really kind of abhorrent and depraved way for people to get assistance, and facing them with impossible choices that further dehumanize and further degrade the population. And on top of this, it's the kind of complete distastefulness that anyone can think that this is an acceptable way to treat a fellow human being. If that's what we think, if this is what it's come to, we think it's acceptable to treat people like that, then I mean, it's completely shameful, yeah.
And in the meantime, we now have growing numbers of Palestinians, particularly infants and young children, dying of starvation. Um, what help us put that in context?
In terms of how this and why this is happening, or
Well, yeah, first of all, why this is happening, and second of all, how the GHF project ties into this, because it's many people
yeah.
are trying to understand why is it that it was precisely in the period after Israel claimed to have established a much more effective and efficient food distribution system that we began to see these horrific images of skeletal children dying of starvation.
Yeah, I mean, look, there've been a few periods throughout the war when blockades have been in place, either across the entire Gaza Strip or in certain parts of Gaza. You remember late last year, Jadaliyya, with no access to Jadaliyya for weeks on end. And then the pressure is released slightly, supplies are replenished, then the media pressure dies down, and the pressure starts ratcheting up yet again. But look, what we've got in the case of these really, really tragic incidents that are happening now with young children is a sustained period in which children have not been able to get the calories or the nutrition that they need. These are tiny infants, pregnant women who are losing weight over the course of their pregnancy, so they're giving birth to malnourished children. And look, unlike us, young children don't have massive reserves of fat, and the calories and the nutrients that they take in are needed to help them grow, whether that be muscles, bone, brain, etc. If there's a sustained period over which they don't get this, and that's what we've seen really since the blockade came in the 2nd of March, and the reserves of food were depleted April, May time. The first of all, the reserves of fat start to get depleted, then muscles start to atrophy, as the only source of energy that the body has got is muscles. As the muscles degrade, they release chemicals into the body that cause an imbalance in relation to organs that then affect the immune system, and mean that at some point these organs eventually they just shut down. They can't stand this anymore. It can be quite a long process for children to become malnourished. We see it in, I mean, in less extreme cases sometimes here, but in relation to to anorexia or whatever when people are starving.
But
And
but if
and then this is, sorry,
please
just to
go
add,
ahead, please.
another part of this is the overall environment in which people are living. 21, 22 months of bombardment, very poor healthcare, very poor hygiene conditions, living in the open air amongst vermin in pretty squalid conditions with a degraded health system, is that their bodies are much more prone to infection anyway as a result of all of this and a result of the mental strain that this is putting on people. So when you pull all this together, as we sadly said, it was inevitable that this would happen. And like you say, it's coincided with a time in which Gaza's received less food than ever since the start of the war. And the type of food that young children and infants need is not what they're getting through packets of macaroni and sunflower oil. So children who need treatment for malnutrition, when they get it, they need to be able to get to health clinics, to get the supplies, to go there for 4, 5, 6 weeks, 1 week after the other, to stabilize. And it's their conditions. And it's only when those conditions are stabilized after several weeks that the children will then start to recover. And none of this has been happening due to the paucity of food, the bombardments and the strain that that's putting on people's mental well-being, and the fact that a third of the population or more has been displaced again since the 18th of March. So you throw all of this together in a situation where it's getting hotter and water isn't available, that it really is only because of the strength of the underlying health system that we're not seeing more people dying. But we will see more people dying. And what's happening right now in relation to the aid coming in is not going to reverse this anytime soon. It's going to need a sustained and a stable provision of aid and other supplies over several weeks to get these young children back on track.
Because, there's been a lot of controversy, if I can use that term, of people seeing these pictures of emaciated children with seemingly healthy looking parents and saying, well, this is obviously all fake. If there was real hunger, why aren't the parents skeletal as well? But if I understand you correctly, one would expect children to atrophy prior to adults, particularly in situations where what little aid is being provided may be sufficient for adults, but it's kind of, not the kinds of food and nutritional supplies that children need. So is it the case that during this phase of mass starvation, one would always expect to see um, uh, children suffering so much first?
Yeah, children will always suffer more, and pregnant women affected as well. It's those that need the nutrients most. I mean, like as I said, we're kind of all right in terms of reserves of fat, reserves of muscle, as are all adults. I mean, it's just a function of life. Whereas children don't have those reserves, and like I say, most of what they're eating is to help them grow.
Mhm.
So they're more prone to begin with. But look, we are also now seeing. I mean, maybe I've not seen the same pictures as you, because certainly the images of children are very harrowing. I mean,
Yes.
nothing we ever thought we would see. I've not looked at the adults and thought, well, they're okay. But I've not paid that much attention to it because these things kind of get seared into your mind. And but what we are hearing and we're seeing is testimonies from our own staff and the levels of hunger, the lack of food that they're eating, stories of staff fainting because of the heat.
We're now talking about the general population, not only
General, well, these are
children.
the UNRWA staff who are
Yes.
fainting. UNRWA staff are relatively middle class. They've got a stable source of income. That income doesn't go very far, but they're better able and equipped to meet their needs than the population at large. And the stories that we're hearing from them in terms of the hardship that they're facing are also deeply worrying. So we are starting to see that as well. Yeah. And sorry, there was one other thing I was going to say, but it slipped my mind. So if it comes
Well,
back.
but also I think you made the point that, and I've heard this elsewhere, that simply, that even if a ceasefire was achieved today, and all the checkpoints were removed, that doesn't solve the problem. It would take a sustained period of recovery before you can say that this crisis is behind us.
Yeah, totally. People need to be able to go to sleep at night
Mm,
knowing that they're not going to get bombed overnight. They need to get the water they need the healthcare they need. We're not going to solve this through bags of flour and 50 trucks of UNRWA food, of WFP food aid or whoever's food aid. We need supplies, we need services, we need well-being, and we need an end to the bombardment and all of this. Because unless we get that, people's mental well-being and their immune systems that are already shot to pieces will become further degraded, and the risk of falling foul of infectious diseases will also remain extremely high. And it's the infection when confronted with a malnourished body. That's what's killing people rather than the lack of energy per
mhm,
se, at least most
mhm,
of the time. And of course, we need lifelong care for the injured, the
mhm,
mentally injured, the physically injured as well. So their ability to access any of this aid from these foundation points is it's impossible. And the number of walking wounded people without limbs, on crutches, in wheelchairs that you see in Gaza is quite extraordinary.
mhm.
So meeting the needs of the most vulnerable as well is difficult.
And we know it can be done. I mean, I think it was in at some point in 2024 when there were fears of a polio outbreak in the Gaza Strip, and there were Israeli fears that this outbreak could spread into Israel by perhaps infecting soldiers at the Gaza Strip. That all of a sudden, the WHO was given authorization to go anywhere it wanted, to vaccinate anyone it wanted. So we know, as you said, it's not a logistical problem. The logistical issues stem from the political decisions that are being taken.
Yeah, look, this is an issue of access and it's an issue of misinformation
Mhm,
and of confrontation that spills out of that. I mean, WHO didn't have complete freedom
mhm,
in terms of where they wanted to go. And it was, I mean, we had torturous meetings into the night every single day to work out the planning on some of this. But it worked. It worked because there's a functioning network of health points, UNRWA, the Ministry of Health. I mean, my organization, we vaccinated 250,000 children against polio during a war,
mhm,
uh, repeatedly.
mhm,
So a remarkable effort. And again, because of the trust of the community in UNRWA and in other service providers and the familiarity with vaccination programs, again, logistically,
mhm,
it wasn't difficult. People showed up. People wanted to get their children vaccinated. They wanted to make them safe. The
mhm,
tragedy of it all was, as we said at the time, that children were being vaccinated and going back to their tents and being bombed.
mhm,
So the whole kind of meaningless of life was really brought to the fore,
mhm,
unfortunately.
mhm. I've already taken a lot of your time, and I would like to finally address the topic of the campaign against UNRWA being waged by the Israeli authorities and others. But before doing that, how many Palestinians seeking aid have been killed trying to receive aid at UNRWA facilities? I mean, if we compare, UNRWA and GHF, was it commonplace for Palestinians to be shot through the head when coming to an UNRWA health clinic, for example, over the years? Or
I mean, I think you know the answer to that. No, we have a pretty unblemished record in terms of our ability to provide the aid safely and dignity and giving people what they need and what they want. So no, I mean, people were not at risk of being shot. People are never at risk of being shot. Reputable aid organizations who are able to distribute and organize their services the way that they want. I mean, what have we seen in the past 6 weeks? 1,000 people being killed, most of them in the vicinity of the GHF sites, some because of attacks on other aid convoys, which again are just a function of the rules of engagement and the fact that 90% of the Gaza Strip is an active conflict zone and people within those areas are quote unquote fair game. But no, we are able to make sure that the most vulnerable get that assistance first. So if the world really does want to put Palestinians at the center of this, then that's the system that we should be advocating for. But as I said, in this kind of world of misinformation and creating our own realities in which we live, it seems very difficult somehow to get that message across to those who have an ability to influence how this actually happens.
And speaking of misinformation, let's now turn to the campaign of UNRWA. UNRWA, of course, has now been formally designated as a terrorist organization by the Israeli parliament, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that was actually they didn't go quite as far
I
as
see.
that. I mean, I yeah, but it was in the
But
original proposal.
so let's begin first to pick up where we left off. Israel claimed that the GHF was required because when UNRWA was responsible for distributing aid, um, it was being systematically looted by Hamas, and that Hamas was taking aid meant for the Palestinian civilian population, either from UNRWA or in collusion with UNRWA, and then selling it at inflated prices at market and using that to fund its military activities. And then this expands into a more general accusation that, I mean, in the crudest version, UNRWA is the aid agency of of Hamas. That UNRWA is either willingly or inadvertently working hand in glove with Hamas, that many of UNRWA staff are active in Hamas, that UNRWA, played a key role in supplying personnel for the attacks of October 7th and all the rest of it. Um, I'd like you, if you don't mind, to begin with addressing specifically the issue of looting of aid, and then to address the more general accusations that are made against UNRWA.
Yeah, so the issue of looting of aid that really came to the fore after the Knesset legislation had come into effect at the end of January, and really, as I understand it, a function of the distributions or the ceasefire and the volumes of aid distributed during the ceasefire and the fact that hostages were released and they were saying that they were fed on UN aid. It wasn't specific to UNRWA as far as I'm aware. It's just the UN-led aid effort in general. Those are the accusations that have been levied. No evidence has been provided of any large-scale diversion or theft of aid by the de factos or the Hamas authorities. And Gaza, at least in the open air, the tunnels are different, of course, but Gaza is the most surveilled place, or one of the most surveilled places on the planet. And you'd like to think, it's hard to understand why that evidence wouldn't have been furnished if it was available. We see
Because
all
it would be
sorts.
impossible not to have it, you're saying.
Oh, it'd be very difficult not to. I mean, we've asked for the evidence because there's like any aid organizations, if there are problems, we need to know about them and we need to work with the member states who are you know, involved in this situation to help us get better. We at UNRWA, WFP, we don't have security services, we don't have intelligence services. But yeah, I just find it hard to believe that this evidence wouldn't have been furnished if it was available. And we've seen all sorts of performances at the Security Council over the years where officials have, produced cartoon images of certain things and the like. So I just find it hard, number one, that's not been produced. Number two, we have nothing to hide. So if this is a problem, then there's no explanation as to why international journalists are not allowed into Gaza to cover the conflict. And we've not witnessed any of this at all. The aid that we provide as UNRWA, we have end-to-end control as to the moment it gets into the Gaza Strip, the moment it gets the person who is designated as the beneficiary of that aid. We can't control what they do
Once they get it.
once they
Yeah.
get it. But I mean, a woman with 8 children is for example, is most likely to either use that aid to feed her children, or if she needs something else, take it to market and sell it for something else because there's no cash in Gaza. So food has become, a commodity for trading, and just because hostages who were released, and thank God they were released, were fed on UN food does not mean that that food, the most likely explanation is that that food was bought from the local market. That itself is no evidence whatsoever of any diversion. And certainly the 16, 17 months that I was in Gaza, we saw some looting by desperate people. We saw looting by criminal gangs, including the same criminal gangs that are now providing security at some of the GHF sites. But
And
we
writing opinion pieces in the Wall Street Journal.
I know it's pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the ghost writers for that one. But yeah, but there's no evidence of this diversion. We didn't see it with our eyes. And Gaza's small. We know why would the de factos be diverting aid when everyone is getting aid anyway and they have trust in the system, and so much was coming in over that short period of time that it wasn't worth looting. It was being sold on the local market for $10, $15 a box because we had no control over how much was coming in. There were humanitarian protocols linked to the ceasefire. So that one we've just not seen any evidence for
And
it.
can I just say, I mean, there have been instances in the past where, for example, UNRWA has discovered that a disused school building was being used by a militant group to store rockets. And UNRWA came out publicly and announced that they had discovered this and denounced the people responsible. So one would assume, that if UNRWA did have evidence of, let's say, the significantly lesser offense of people stealing bags of flour, that it would also have informed us.
Yeah, I'm duty bound to do it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Gaza was awash with tunnels, and many of these tunnels went underneath UNRWA installations. They didn't break ground UNRWA under installations, but the insinuation was made, and of course, if any acts and practices by any parties of the conflict that are undermining the safety of our facilities and the inviolability of those facilities, we protest vociferously and aggressively, and we will continue to do that with all parties to the conflict for as long as we continue providing services inside of Gaza. And I've not signed off. I've not, we're not doing it in relation to this. The rationale and I just don't understand why it would happen. But like I say, I mean, can we if we could have the evidence, then then we could look into it. But no evidence has been provided, not just to UNRWA, but to WFP and other large providers of
But
welfare.
are you also saying that the looting that is supposedly going on wouldn't make sense from the perspective of those who are supposed to be looting because there's really not much to be gained from it? Is it that?
Well, no, I mean, there's looting that takes place on a kind of localized level. What is being insinuated here that there is central government systematic looting of aid to power and fill the coffers of Hamas to allow them to continue prosecuting whatever it is they're still prosecuting in Gaza. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is, I mean, it's Gaza, so it's not large clans, it's families or tribes, it's families that have control of certain bits of the Gaza Strip that are the ones organizing the looting and the criminal activities there. And it's no coincidence that this is all happening in the southeastern corner of Gaza because these are the old smuggling routes. These are the old collaborators' villages. These are the old, dating back to ancient times, going all the way up to the disengagement and the way that Gaza's divided. So you've got families, branches of which are on, some are in Gaza, some are in Israel, some are in Egypt, working with the collusion of whoever. That's how a lot of this has been happening. Elements and gangs that were able to wander within a couple of hundred yards of Israeli tanks with weapons,
Unmolested.
unmolested. I mean, this doesn't happen to most people, whether they've got arms or not in these areas. But they were able to operate pretty freely in those areas over sustained periods of time. We saw them with our own eyes. So this wasn't state sanctioned. This was individual elements that were doing it. I mean, and ironically, the kind of elements that Hamas clamped down on when they were in authority, very, very brutally some of the time, that have risen up in response to the vacuum created by their absence and the lawlessness created by 21 months of conflict. Now, I'm not advocating for a return of Hamas in any way, but just describing the dynamic in
You're now
which
talking about January, February of this year.
yeah, December, January,
Right.
February of this year, when the looting, when the attacks on trucks, when the theft of age, it really reached a breaking point that we didn't know where this would have gone had the ceasefire not come into effect. So then, within 2 or 3 days of the ceasefire coming into effect, all of this was forgotten.
Hmm.
The gangs vanished, the aid flowed, and people could get what they needed. Uh, yeah.
My final question, Sam, there's been a long-standing campaign against UNRWA, based on, a lot of misinformation that, people think that you have to be registered with UNRWA to have the status of a Palestinian refugee, whereas in fact, the only thing registration with UNRWA means is that you're eligible for its services, and you can be in Iraq or Egypt and have absolutely no relationship with UNRWA and still be have the legal status of a refugee. But there's been a long-standing campaign against UNRWA. It was always my impression um, that it was not so much against UNRWA as such, but that UNRWA was being targeted as kind of the most visible surrogate, if you will, of the Palestinian refugee question. And the thinking was you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the Palestinian refugee question. And so it was part of, let's say, a broader political campaign whose objectives went well beyond UNRWA. But I think what we've seen during the past year was specifically directed against UNRWA. And what I mean by that is, in previous times, irrespective of the intensity of the attacks and smear campaigns against UNRWA, it was still able to operate in the occupied territories. Not only that, the Israelis insisted that it continue to operate because it relieved them of some of their own responsibilities. But now we have a situation where UNRWA has been banned from operating the Gaza Strip. I think you yourself are now prohibited from entering the Gaza Strip by the Israeli authorities. How would you explain this shift, if you indeed agree that there has been one?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to start, Mine, I mean, we're not banned from operating per se.
Mhm.
What we're not able to do, I mean, the laws talk about our operations on the sovereign territory of Israel, which for Israel includes East Jerusalem, hence the attacks or the closure of the schools there and the
And
crucial.
Shafat refugee camp. Mm, mm.
Yes. But it also prohibits contact between UNRWA and Israeli officials, and that what that means is that our supply chains we can't bring our supplies in, but the services in Gaza continue. I mean, we've got 11,000, 12,000 staff working on any given day, 1,500 health professionals, 1,000 garbage collectors, several hundred social workers, thousands upon thousands of teachers, many of whom are running the collective centers, the shelters where hundreds of thousands of people are, and many of whom are actually doing teaching. So the operations continue. International staff are not allowed to participate on the rotations of humanitarian personnel. So that's why I'm not in Gaza right now and
And
haven't
you
been.
wouldn't be able to go to the West Bank either, for that matter.
No, I wouldn't be able to go to the West Bank. So our West Bank staff our internationals have also been are not able to remain there. For them, it was more linked to a visa. The
Mm.
Israeli visa expired. I don't need a visa to go to Gaza, but I do need the approval of the Israeli authorities. And yeah, like you say, there was this kind of delicate balance between UNRWA and Israel until October the 7th, a kind of understanding that on the one hand, yes, we did, in their view, maintain and keep visible the Palestinian or Palestine refugee issue. So that was persisting in their view because of UNRWA, but we absolved them of responsibilities as an occupying power to provide services. And somehow, kind of ironically, we also took some of the pressure off the host authorities, whether that was the PA or subsequently Hamas, in terms of providing services, because you had this fine bureaucracy, of generations of really strong systems and structures and professional staff and high quality materials, etc. So you had this kind of civil service that was there. And it was an uneasy relationship. Whenever there was a conflict, accusations would be would be thrown. The commissioners general often had a hard time speaking out, things like that, as you know well. But this, it was all managed within what kind of Tariq Bakoni refers to as this violent equilibrium, that every now and then it would flare up and
Hmm.
then it would die down, and we'd enjoy kind of constructive working relations with each other. We provided our staff lists to the Israeli authorities twice a year. Every single UNRWA staff member, all the host authorities plus Israel, received our lists of staff twice a year, unlike any other entity
So they
operating.
signed off on all the senior Hamas commanders they allege were.
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask them. They don't pick up the phone anymore. But yeah, this was the dynamic. This was what we were doing, and I mean, and in a way, it did change with the 7th of October, but in a way that the whole model and construct for managing the conflict changed on October the 7th, going down to, not we don't have to go all the way back to the 80s and what Israel did in terms of divide and rule and kind of help support and encourage Hamas, but more recently in relation to turning a blind eye and knowing full well about the tunnels, which allowed Israel to keep the blockade in place for domestic purposes without,
And
well,
just to interrupt, because I mean the tunnels, are best known to the broader public for being used to smuggle in weaponry and used in military operations, but they also formed an absolutely vital lifeline for consumer goods for many years.
yeah, and again, I mean, the tunnels are, they date back thousands of years across one of the oldest smuggling routes in the world. And what they allowed Israel to do was domestically
Mhm.
hold the line in relation to the blockade and say that, the control that was being exercised in terms of entry of goods and personnel, whilst reducing the pressure inside Gaza so that reconstruction could take place and that the five-star, the 20-story buildings, the multi-story buildings, the restaurants, the cafes, the mosques, all of this stuff that was built inside of Gaza over the past 10 years was not possible with the cement that was coming in through the official channels. It was this illegal economy that was regularized, which also took the edge off the unemployment crisis
Mhm.
facing Gaza's young people when the blockade came into effect. So that is what has filled the coffers of Hamas over the years. Also allowed, weapons to come and go, fighters
Because they
to
also taxed goods coming in.
there was a proper tax regime that was set up
Mhm.
in relation to the tunnels, as well as a kind of catastrophic Ponzi and
Mhm.
pyramid scheme that you may remember that people bought into 10 or 15 years ago. But this, I mean, the tunnels have been a key feature of the Palestinian economy for a long time. And Salim Ajlouni, who you may remember, he did some really kind of great work for UNRWA back, in the day on this, showing how the tunnels were generating employment. NGOs couldn't find young people to work for them in the before Operation Cast Lead because everyone was working in the tunnels, and that was just one element. In the same way that the Qatari money coming in to pay Hamas through with Israel say so, all these elements that were there to kind of manage the conflict and keep a lid on it to avoid a situation where it would flare up and that there wouldn't be a major escalation. That all just disappeared on October the 7th, given the gravity of these atrocities carried out by Hamas on the one hand, and the need for Israel to reassert its control and its invincibility, as it were, whilst dealing with mass collective trauma that continues to this day. But just as one side is traumatized, so the Palestinian side is massively, massively traumatized as well. And yeah, allegations were made about a tiny number of UNRWA staff. And I mean, the Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, put these staff on, he got rid of them immediately without due process, which isn't easy in a bureaucracy like the UN, but putting the interests of the agency first. And an independent investigation was launched and concluded by a UN office that found that a small number may have been involved. We were never party to any information as to the degree of their involvement, but with the exception of one donor, all other donors resumed funding to UNRWA. So I'd like to think if there was solid evidence that pointed not just to the wrongdoing of individuals, but the rottenness of the institution, then this wouldn't have happened. I mean, show me an institution anywhere in the world with 30,000 staff where there aren't a few, wrongdoers. I mean, look anywhere, the
Yeah, but you
BBC.
began to get also these crazy accusations that UNRWA knew who these staff were and what they were doing and either looked the other way or enabled them or I mean the level of craziness in these accusations just seems to increase by the month.
Yeah. And we got to the point now where the truth doesn't really matter. So people can just,
It's what
if
you
we
want to believe about UNRWA that matters.
exactly, and it's fascinating in terms of human behavior. If it wasn't so serious, I'm just not sure we're changing anyone's mind on any of this.
Mm,
People are having their minds changed by what they're reading over the breakfast tables with these horrific images. But
mm.
I think people's views on UNRWA, I'm not sure people aren't really listening to each other with what's being said. But yeah, that changed completely with October the 7th, and UNRWA is now considered as part of the problem, which is absolutely abhorrent. If we put Palestinians and what they need in the middle of this for once, and stop talking about trucks in this elusive attempt to kind of gain some kind of control over this and dehumanize it. But what UNRWA and UNRWA staff have done over the past 21 months is some of the most remarkable accomplishments of any UN workforce anywhere in the world, if not the most remarkable accomplishment. Given what my staff do on a daily basis, the hardships that they put up with, their I wouldn't say resilience because it's a horrible word, but they're so resolute, they're so defiant, they're so committed. I mean, this has become the meaning of life, right? Just to continue for themselves, to have some element of control over what they do and serve their communities in the most desperate of circumstances. That is what should be being talked about, not, the actions, if proven, of a minuscule number of staff, and if proven weak, of course we they're absolutely abhorrent and they're horrendous and they shouldn't have happened. But the institution that's continued and been able to do all of this stuff, like I said, we give water to 1.3 million people in Gaza. 250,000 people a day get water from UNRWA. Half of all health consultations take place in UNRWA clinics. How my staff are able to carry on doing this, I mean, we say blithely they have no choice, but I mean, they do, and they carry on doing it, and they get out of their tents every single day, looking at the rest of the community being driven around in the UN community in armored vehicles, getting food parcels, usually getting accommodation. They have none of that. They don't complain. They just carry on. That is what we should be talking about. That is the strength of UNRWA and UNRWA in particular in Gaza. That's what we've delivered, and that is what the legacy should be. Not this misinformation, this disinformation, this propaganda. But look, on one side you've got UNRWA as a UN agency. On the other side, you've got a state with the backing of the most powerful state by several degrees of magnitude in the world, and we can't compete. We're fighting this war of information with them that is so, debilitating and demotivating and hurtful. There's no way we can win it. But we try because we have to, and we point out the ridiculousness and the egregious. But with some of these claims that put staff live in real danger, and that's what's completely unacceptable. And these people are just trying to serve their community, and it's not in anyone's interest, including Israel's, that these services aren't continued for both for me are able to continue to meet the needs of the population today that UNRWA is uniquely placed to do, but also to provide any meaningful horizon to people in the future. If you rip out the most functioning civil service in Gaza, or part of the civil service, in terms of this basic social protection and public health floor that we provide, people will be worse off for decades, and we'll have that to deal with. And but no one wants to talk about that. The problem is UNRWA, not what you're going to do and how you're going to meet these needs if UNRWA isn't there. But the problem is UNRWA, and it's And it's on the one hand deeply frustrating, but it's what keeps us going.
On that note, Sam Rose, thank you so much for sharing your time, your insights, and your expertise with Connections. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. My pleasure.